Marcus Thompson had
Looks like
learned
the
to measure
alternator
time
might
in
be the issue.
heartbeats.
I'll need to check the
Standing in the
belt. Do you need
packed
any
Millbrook
assistance or
Town
tools from
Hall
the
7
patrol car?
months from now, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like distant wasps, he would count 143 beats between the moment he approached the podium and the moment Tom Whitmore stood to accuse him of race baiting. But that night lived in a future Marcus couldn't yet see. Separated from this November afternoon by a chain of choices he hadn't made, and a woman he'd convinced himself he'd forgotten. The patrol car sat crooked on the shoulder of Route 9, hazard lights painting amber streaks across dead grass. Marcus eased his foot off the accelerator, the truck's engine settling into an idle that matched the unsteady rhythm in his chest. His daughter's voice came from the back seat, high and certain. "Daddy, someone needs help." The rearview mirror framed Lily's face, 8 years old with a gap between her front teeth that made her smile look like an interrupted melody. Her science textbook lay open across her lap, a diagram of the solar system visible from where Marcus sat gripping the steering wheel. "I see them, baby." But seeing and stopping occupied different territories in Marcus's mind, separated by 19 years and the weight of a knee pressed between his shoulder blades on a midnight highway outside Syracuse. He'd been 24 then, driving home from a double shift at the garage, tail light legitimately broken. The officer's voice had carried the bored certainty of a man who'd performed the same ritual 1,000 times. Hands on the hood, legs apart, don't move, don't speak, don't breathe wrong. The asphalt had smelled like old motor oil and something chemical Marcus never identified, and by the time they'd let him go, no citation, no apology, no acknowledgement that 40 minutes of his life had been carved out and discarded, the fear had crystallized into a rule he'd carried ever since. Avoid situations where the outcome depends on someone else's perception of your skin. "Aren't you going to help?" Lily's question held no judgment, only the pure confusion of a child who hadn't yet learned that helping could be dangerous, that visibility could be fatal, that a black man approaching a police vehicle on an empty stretch of highway carried calculations her third-grade mind wouldn't understand for years, if ever. God willing, if ever. Marcus pulled onto the shoulder 30 yards behind the patrol car. The digital clock on the dashboard read 4:47 p.m. Tuesday, November 12th. The kind of detail that mattered later when you needed to reconstruct timelines, establish credibility, prove you were where you said you were when you said you were there. "Stay in the truck, Lily. Lock the doors after I get out." "But Daddy..." "Lock them. I'll be right there where you can see me." He stepped onto gravel that crunched like small bones under his work boots. The afternoon had that particular upstate New York chill that November specialized in. Cold enough to sting your face, but not cold enough to justify calling it winter. The kind of weather that made you remember every coat you couldn't afford to replace. Marcus kept his hands visible at his sides, not quite raised, but not quite relaxed either. The posture of a man who'd learned to occupy space apologetically. The officer turned at the sound of his approach, one hand moving toward her belt in a motion so automatic it barely registered as threat. Just reflex. Just training. Just the choreography of American law enforcement meeting American black maleness on a quiet road. Then she removed her sunglasses. The world performed a magic trick Marcus didn't understand, pulling 12 years through a hole in the present and depositing them at his feet like evidence. Sarah. Not Sarah Dawson anymore. The name on her badge read Mitchell S., which meant marriage or divorce or some third option Marcus's racing mind couldn't process. But Sarah's face, Sarah's eyes, Sarah's mouth forming a shape that might have been his name if sound had been traveling through the air between them instead of just shock. "Daddy, you okay?" Lily's voice carried from the truck, high and worried, and Marcus forced his lungs to remember their basic function. "Breathe in." Breathe out. Stand here on this highway shoulder while the past climbs out of a police cruiser and looks at you like you're a ghost she wasn't prepared to see. Car trouble. His voice came out steadier than it had any right to be. Years of practice at keeping his tone carefully neutral, carefully non-threatening, carefully calibrated to disappear into whatever interaction required him to shrink. Alternator, I think. Sarah's professional mask slid into place with visible effort, and Marcus recognized the gesture from 1,000 nights when they'd been young and stupid and convinced love could outlast anything. She'd always retreated into competence when emotions threatened to overwhelm, organizing her feelings into neat compartments like files in a cabinet. Work face, social face, intimate face, each one distinct, each one a shield. It just died. Radio's out too. Marcus nodded, the motion careful and deliberate. A sedan passed going 60, the driver's head swiveling to track the scene. Black man. White female officer. The driver would construct a narrative from those two facts, fill in details that confirmed whatever story they needed to believe about the world. Marcus had learned to feel those gazes like pressure changes before a storm. Mind if I take a look? Sarah hesitated, and in that pause, Marcus felt the weight of everything unsaid. The apartment in Albany where he'd woken one morning to find her closet empty and her toothbrush gone. The ring he'd carried in his pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to ask a question she'd never let him voice. The 9 months he'd spent calling her phone until the number disconnected, asking her friends who claimed ignorance, driving past her mother's house in Schenectady until her brother threatened to call the cops. The years after when he'd slowly, painfully taught himself to stop wondering why. Yeah, okay. The engine compartment opened with a metallic groan that seemed too loud for the quiet afternoon. Marcus leaned over the machinery, aware of every car that slowed to observe, every set of eyes that calculated risk and drew conclusions. His hands found the alternator connection, fingers working automatically through the diagnosis his brain had performed 1,000 times on 1,000 different vehicles. Loose wire, simple fix, 3 minutes with the right tools. Looks like a connection came loose. I've got tools in my truck. He walked back to his vehicle, conscious of his gait, his posture, the way his shoulders carried tension he couldn't quite release. Lily had pressed her face against the window, breath fogging the glass. Is the police lady okay? She's fine, baby. Just need to help with her car. The toolbox sat in its familiar spot behind the driver's seat, red metal scarred from a decade of use. Marcus had bought it the same year he'd met Sarah, back when he was still convinced that competence and hard work could build a future solid enough to withstand anything. Funny how some tools outlasted the dreams that purchased them. Sarah stood exactly where he'd left her, arms crossed, eyes tracking the highway traffic. Marcus registered the defensive posture, the way she'd positioned herself to keep both him and the passing vehicles in her peripheral vision. She was worried too. Not about him, perhaps, but about optics, about what someone might assume, about how quickly a misunderstanding could metastasize into something irreversible. The repair took 4 minutes. The engine turned over on the first try, a sound like permission to leave, to end this interaction before it demanded more than either of them could afford to give. That should hold until you can get it to a mechanic. Sarah nodded, but she didn't move toward the driver's seat. Her gaze drifted to Marcus's truck, to the small face still visible through the back window. Is that your daughter? The question carried weight that had nothing to do with curiosity. Marcus heard all the unasked follow-ups, the timeline she was calculating, the math that would tell her whether this child represented a life he'd built in her absence or proof he'd moved on faster than grief should allow. Yes, Lily. She's beautiful. Before Marcus could construct a response that didn't require excavating 12 years of accumulated scar tissue, Lily's voice cut across the cold air. "Daddy, I'm hungry. You said we'd get ice cream." Despite everything, despite the impossible coincidence and the accumulated weight of memory and the very real fear that still lived in his spine, Marcus felt his mouth twitch toward something adjacent to a smile. Sarah laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle her as much as it startled Marcus. "Ice cream in November? She's persuasive." Sarah took a step toward the truck, bending slightly to wave at the small face pressed against the glass. "Hi there, what's your name?" "Lily. I'm 8 years old." "That's a nice name." "Daddy says I was named after the flowers. They're strong and they bend in the wind but don't break." Sarah straightened, and when she looked at Marcus again, some of the professional distance had dissolved from her eyes. What remained was harder to categorize. Memory, maybe. Or regret. Or the particular species of pain that comes from standing 3 feet from a person you once knew better than your own pulse and realizing you've both become strangers wearing familiar faces. "Thank you. For stopping." Anyone would have. They both understood the lie in that statement, but neither challenged it. Marcus gathered his tools and walked back to his truck, aware of Sarah's eyes following him until he closed the driver's door. The engine started with its usual reluctant growl. In the rearview mirror, Sarah stood beside her cruiser, one hand raised in a gesture that might have been goodbye or might have been something else entirely. Lily was already negotiating ice cream flavors before they'd traveled half a mile. "Can I get 2 scoops?" "With sprinkles." "1 scoop, no sprinkles." "No, that's not fair. Emma gets 2 scoops." Emma's mother makes different decisions than I do. But Marcus barely heard the familiar argument. His mind had snagged on a loop of memory, replaying images he'd spent years trying to file away. Sarah's apartment in Albany, small and cluttered with textbooks from her social work program. The fold-out couch where they'd spent Sunday mornings reading the newspaper, her legs draped across his lap. The kitchen table where he'd planned to ask the question, before she'd looked at him with eyes that already held goodbye. "We need to talk." 4 words. The universal precursor to ending. Marcus had arrived at her apartment that evening carrying Chinese takeout and the ring box he'd hidden in his jacket pocket, rehearsing variations of the speech he'd practiced for 3 weeks. Sarah had been sitting on the couch, still wearing her work clothes, hands folded in her lap like a penitent. "I can't do this anymore." He'd been so stunned by the statement that he'd forgotten to set down the takeout, had stood there holding paper bags that leaked soy sauce while his prepared speech evaporated like mist. "Can't do what?" "This. Us. Any of it. I'm sorry, Marcus. I just can't." Then she was gone. Not that night. She'd asked him to leave, her voice carrying a brittleness that brooked no argument. But the next day, he'd called 7 times before giving up, had driven back to her apartment to find the door opened by a confused subletter who'd signed a lease that morning. Sarah's phone number disconnected 3 days later. Her mother claimed not to know where she'd gone. Her brother suggested, with barely concealed hostility, that Marcus stop calling before it became harassment. For 9 months, Marcus had constructed elaborate fantasies. Maybe she'd joined a cult. Maybe she'd witnessed a crime and entered protection. Maybe she'd developed amnesia. Anything seemed more plausible than the simple truth that she'd chosen to erase him from her life with the thoroughness of someone removing a stain. Eventually, he'd stopped looking, had sold the ring to a pawn shop in Troy for $800, $200 less than he'd paid. Had moved to Millbrook when May called to say she'd found a foreclosed farm that banks were selling cheap to anyone willing to take on the repairs. Had built a life from the kind of small, deliberate choices that accumulate into something resembling normalcy if you don't examine them too closely. And now Sarah was here, in Millbrook, wearing a badge and driving a patrol car and looking at him like she'd forgotten he existed until the universe forced them into the same geographic coordinates. The farmhouse appeared around the bend in the road, white paint peeling from boards that needed replacing, porch steps that creaked their complaint with every footfall. 3 acres of land that Marcus had worked for 8 years, transforming overgrown fields into something productive through sheer stubborn effort. The kind of property his grandfather would have called a home place, though Marcus suspected the old man would have had questions about whether any place could truly be home when you spent every interaction calculating the safest way to occupy space. May sat in her rocking chair on the porch, wool blanket across her lap despite the relative warmth of the afternoon. 73 years old, arthritis visible in the way her fingers curled around the blanket's edge, heart working harder than it should, according to the cardiologist who'd used terms like manageable and lifestyle adjustments to avoid saying what they both knew. May was running out of time, measured in months or years depending on how generous you wanted to be with definitions. Lily exploded from the truck before Marcus had fully parked, running toward the porch with the boundless energy of a child who hadn't yet learned that the world required careful navigation. "Grandma May, we saw a police lady and Daddy fixed her car and she was really pretty and I'm getting ice cream." May's eyes found Marcus over Lily's head, sharp and knowing. She'd raised 5 foster children over 4 decades, had learned to read the silences between words, the weight that settled into shoulders when something significant had shifted in the day's architecture. "You're late. Got held up on Route 9. Trouble?" Marcus lifted the toolbox from the truck bed, its weight familiar and grounding. "Nothing I couldn't handle." He climbed the porch steps, set the toolbox beside the door, and met May's gaze. She studied him with the same intensity she'd deployed when he was 15 and angry and convinced the world was actively conspiring to crush him. Back then, she'd been the only foster mother willing to take a teenager with his record. 3 schools, 2 group homes, 1 juvenile detention stint for a fight he'd started because another kid had used a word Marcus's rage wouldn't tolerate. May had looked at him across her kitchen table and said, "You can be angry or you can be smart. Both will use up your energy. Choose which one builds something." Who was it? She already knew. May had this uncanny ability to extract truth through patience, waiting until the silence became more uncomfortable than confession. Sarah Dawson. Sarah Mitchell now, I guess. May's rocking chair went still. That girl who left? She's a cop now, working in town apparently. Inside the house, Lily's voice echoed as she called for her grandmother to come see her new coloring book. May didn't move, her attention fixed on Marcus with the laser focus of someone who understood that some moments required witnessing. "How do you feel about that?" The question was so characteristically May, direct, unavoidable, demanding honesty, that Marcus almost laughed. How did he feel? Like someone had reached into his chest and rearranged his organs, like 12 years had collapsed into 12 seconds, like every carefully constructed defense he'd built had revealed itself to be tissue paper masquerading as stone. "I feel like it doesn't matter how I feel. She's here, I'm here, we'll probably run into each other." He shrugged, a gesture he didn't quite feel. "It's a small town." May rose slowly from her chair, the blanket falling aside. She placed a weathered hand on his arm, fingers warm through his sleeve. "You've built something good here, Marcus. For yourself, for that child. Don't let old ghosts shake the foundation." She moved past him into the house, leaving Marcus alone on the porch with the November cold and the memory of Sarah's face when she'd recognized him. He stood there until the sun started its descent toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades that reminded him of bruises, purple and orange, and that particular blue that exists only in the threshold between day and night. Inside, the house smelled like the pot roast May had started that morning, slow-cooked with carrots and potatoes until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork. Lily had spread her homework across the kitchen table, math problems and spelling words competing for space with the coloring book she'd mentioned. May sat in her chair by the window, knitting needles clicking in the rhythm Marcus had known since he was 15. He started dinner preparations automatically, pulling vegetables from the refrigerator, finding the cutting board worn smooth by decades of use. The knife work required just enough attention to quiet the louder thoughts, reducing the day to the simple equation of blade meeting vegetable, celery and onions and peppers, forming small piles that would eventually become something nourishing. But even cooking couldn't fully silence the question that had been building since the moment Sarah removed her sunglasses. Why now? Why Millbrook? Why this town, this job, this specific intersection of time and geography that forced them into each other's orbit after 12 years of successful avoidance? Coincidence seemed too convenient, but intention seemed too painful, which left some third option Marcus couldn't quite name, a possibility that lived in the space between accident and purpose. Lily's voice cut through his thoughts. "Daddy, what's 7 times 8? 56. Are you sure?" "Very sure." "How do you know?" "Because I learned it when I was your age, and I've used it about 10,000 times since." Lily made a note in her workbook, then looked up with an expression that Marcus had learned to recognize as the precursor to a difficult question. "Daddy, do you know the police lady from before?" The knife stilled against the cutting board. May's knitting needles stopped their clicking. The house held its breath. "Yes, a long time ago." "Were you friends?" Friends. What a wholly inadequate word for what they'd been. Lovers, yes. Partners, briefly. The person whose laugh Marcus had memorized in 3 octaves, whose morning face he'd known better than his own, whose body he'd mapped with the thoroughness of a cartographer claiming new territory. Something like that. What happened? Sometimes people need to go away for reasons we don't understand. Lily absorbed this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned to parse adult evasions for hidden meaning. Her own mother, Marcus's ex-girlfriend from a brief, catastrophic relationship, when he was 35 and lonely and convinced companionship could be built from shared desperation, had left when Lily was 6 months old. Walked out with a note that said, "I can't do this," and an address in Nevada where she promised to send money once she got settled. The money never came. Neither did she. So Lily understood abandonment in the way children do. Not as abstract concept, but as lived reality. She knew that adults disappeared, that promises meant less than the breath required to voice them, that love was a gamble you could lose even when you played by the rules. Is she going to go away again? I don't know, baby. Do you want her to? Marcus set down the knife and turned to face his daughter, this small person whose existence had become the organizing principle of his life. The reason he woke up and went to work and came home and made dinner and read bedtime stories, even when exhaustion made his bones feel like lead. I don't know that either. It was the most honest answer he could give. The most honest answer he had. That night, after Lily had gone to bed and May had retired to her room with a glass of water and her evening pills, Marcus sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge in the November sky. The cold had sharpened, carrying that particular bite that announced winter's imminent arrival. In 6 weeks, snow would make the roads treacherous. In 3 months, ice would coat the fields in crystal sheets that caught the morning sun and turned the farm into something from a fairy tale, beautiful and inhospitable in equal measure. His phone sat on the porch railing, silent and accusatory. He could look her up. Sarah Mitchell, Millbrook Sheriff's Department. The internet would provide details, fill in the gaps, construct a narrative from public records and social media posts. But Marcus didn't reach for the phone. Some questions didn't deserve easy answers. Some gaps were better left unfilled. Instead, he thought about the ring, the one he'd bought from a jeweler in Albany who'd offered a payment plan, $800 down, $200 a month for 12 months. Marcus had worked double shifts at the garage, taking on oil changes and brake jobs that barely paid enough to justify the effort. The ring had cost $2,400, modest by engagement standards, but more money than Marcus had ever spent on a single object. A thin gold band with a small diamond that caught light and threw it back in facets that seemed to multiply in Sarah's presence. He'd carried it for 3 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. Sarah had loved Washington Park in the fall, had dragged him there on Sunday afternoons to walk the paths and watch dogs chase tennis balls and pretend they were the kind of couple who had picnics and fed ducks and planned futures that extended beyond next month's rent. Marcus had imagined proposing there on a bench overlooking the pond, leaves falling around them like benediction. Then she'd said, "We need to talk," and everything had ended before it began. The ring had sat in Marcus's dresser drawer for 3 years, a small weight he couldn't quite justify keeping but couldn't quite bring himself to discard. Eventually, desperation had made the decision for him. May's medication had increased in cost. The farm's well pump had failed. The choice between a symbol and survival hadn't been a choice at all. He'd sold it to a pawn shop in Troy, had walked out with $800 in 20s that felt like blood money, used it to pay for the pump repair, never told May where the money came from, tried not to think about some stranger wearing the ring he'd bought for Sarah, attaching different meanings to the gold, making different promises to different futures. And now Sarah was here, and the past wasn't past at all, just dormant, waiting for the right conditions to resurrect itself. The Saturday farmers market in Millbrook occupied 4 blocks of Main Street, vendors setting up before dawn to claim the best spots. Marcus had been coming for 3 years, long enough to know which farmers had the best tomatoes, which baker made bread that didn't turn to sawdust by evening, which vendor would slip Lily an extra apple when May wasn't looking. It was one of the few public spaces where Marcus could relax marginally, where the rhythms of commerce and community created a buffer against the constant low-grade vigilance that characterized most of his interactions in town. Lily loved the market for the kettle corn, dragging Marcus to the same vendor every week to negotiate for the largest bag her allowance could afford. May loved it for the socialization, the chance to catch up with women she'd known for 4 decades, trading gossip and recipes with the casual intimacy of people who'd watched each other age. Marcus loved it because for 2 hours every Saturday, he could pretend normalcy was achievable. They were examining winter squash at the Muller farm stand when Marcus saw her. Sarah stood 3 stalls down, dressed in civilian clothes, blue sweater, jeans, hair loose around her shoulders. She looked different without the uniform, softer somehow. Though she carried herself with the same careful posture Marcus remembered, shoulders squared as if perpetually preparing for confrontation. She saw them at the same moment. For a breath, neither moved. Then Lily spotted her, and the decision was made. "Daddy, it's the police lady!" Before Marcus could formulate a response, Lily had broken away and was running toward Sarah with the boundless enthusiasm that only children possessed, that ability to hurtle toward new experiences without considering consequences. Sarah saw her coming and knelt, bringing herself to Lily's eye level with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to meet children on their terms. "Hi, remember me? I'm Lily." "Of course I remember you, the ice cream girl. We got mint chocolate chip. It's the best flavor. What's your favorite?" "Probably strawberry." Lily wrinkled her nose with dramatic emphasis. "That's a boring choice." Marcus had caught up by then, May trailing at a slower pace, and he felt compelled to intervene. "Lily, that's not polite." "But it's true," Sarah laughed, standing up to meet Marcus's eyes. "She's not wrong. It is a boring choice. I've just always liked it." The interaction drew attention from nearby vendors and shoppers. Marcus felt their eyes, the weight of observation, the unspoken questions. A black man, a white woman, a child between them. People making calculations, forming assumptions. In a town this size, where everyone knew everyone's business and gossip traveled faster than fact, this encounter would be dissected over dinner tables and coffee meetings, transformed into narrative that confirmed whatever biases the observers already held. One of the vendors, Carl Henderson, who sold honey and beeswax candles from hives he kept on property outside town, leaned over his table with the casual aggression of someone who believed his age granted him immunity from courtesy. "You two know each other." The question was directed at Sarah, but the implication was clear. "Explain this. Justify this proximity. Account for why you're standing here talking to him." "He helped me with car trouble last week. I was stranded on Route 9. Carl nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Marcus a moment too long. "Good Samaritan, then." "Something like that." Marcus put his hand on Lily's shoulder, the gesture both protective and proprietary. "We should get going. Still need to pick up eggs." But Lily had other plans. "Wait! I want to show her my loose tooth." "Maybe next time, baby." Sarah's smile had faded, replaced by something more complicated. She'd registered the undercurrents, the tension that thrummed beneath the surface of ordinary interaction. She understood, perhaps better than Marcus had expected, how quickly innocent exchanges could be perceived as something else, how the simple act of two adults talking could be weaponized in the right hands. "It was good to see you, Lily." She met Marcus's eyes, held them for a half-second longer than necessary. "You too, Marcus." She said his name like she was testing it, remembering how it felt in her mouth, relearning the shape of syllables she'd spoken 1,000 times in a different life. Then she turned and walked toward the parking area, leaving Marcus and Lily standing beside Carl Henderson's honey stand while May caught up, breathing harder than the short walk should have warranted. They completed their shopping in relative silence, Lily chattering about everything and nothing, the cool weather, the pumpkins still on display at the produce stand, the dog she'd seen tied up outside the coffee shop. Marcus listened with half his attention, the other half processing what had just happened, the implications of a 3-minute interaction that would ripple through Millbrook's social networks like a stone dropped in still water. Sarah could leave whenever she wanted. She had that freedom, that mobility. A promotion in another county, a transfer to a different jurisdiction, a better opportunity somewhere else. She could simply disappear again, just as she had 12 years ago, and the town would forget she'd ever been here within 6 months. But Marcus was rooted. His farm, his daughter, his mother. His life was built into this soil, bound to this place by choices and circumstances that accumulated into something immovable. He couldn't just pull up stakes when things got uncomfortable, couldn't relocate when gossip started to bite, couldn't escape the consequences of being visible in a town that preferred he remain invisible. That was the cost Sarah never had to pay, the cost she probably never even thought about. "Daddy, you're squeezing my hand too hard." Marcus loosened his grip immediately, looking down at his daughter with something approaching alarm. "Sorry, baby." "Are you okay?" She looked up at him with concern that no 7-year-old should have to feel, and Marcus realized he'd been teaching her to read his moods, to monitor his emotional state, to take responsibility for adult anxieties she couldn't possibly understand or resolve. Another way the world's weight got distributed downward, how children of color learned too young that their safety depended on managing other people's comfort. "I'm fine. Just thinking." About what? About how to explain a world that doesn't make sense. About how to teach you to navigate spaces that weren't built for us. About how to love you enough to prepare you without scaring you. About whether I'm strong enough to protect you from everything you'll eventually face. About what kind of eggs we should get, brown or white. Brown. They look like chocolate. They don't taste like chocolate. I know. But they could if you believed hard enough. Marcus laughed despite himself, and the weight on his chest eased slightly. This child, this impossible, wonderful child. She made everything bearable. They paid for their eggs and walked back to the truck, May trailing a few steps behind, watching Marcus with eyes that had witnessed 4 decades of black men navigating white spaces, learning when to speak and when to stay silent, when to assert and when to yield, the endless, exhausting calculus of survival in a country that claimed to have moved beyond race while demonstrating daily that the claim was aspirational at best. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Marcus caught sight of Sarah one more time. She stood alone beside her car, watching them drive away. The look on her face was one Marcus couldn't quite decipher, but it stayed with him long after Millbrook's Main Street disappeared in the rearview mirror, long after they'd driven home and unloaded groceries and settled into the afternoon routine that structured their Saturdays. It stayed with him through dinner, through Lily's bath time, through the evening ritual of stories and tucking in and promises that tomorrow would be better, bigger, brighter than today. It stayed with him as he sat on the porch again, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, navigation points that had guided travelers for millennia, but offered no direction for the journey Marcus found himself beginning. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. Marcus stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Hello? Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice he would have recognized in a crowd of thousands, across decades, through static and distance, and every wall he'd built to keep it out. Marcus, it's Sarah. I need to talk to you. The same evening, November 12th, Tuesday, 3 hours after Sarah's phone call, the kitchen light cast shadows that seemed to argue with each other across the worn linoleum. Marcus had made tea, Earl Grey, May's favorite, though his hands had functioned on autopilot while his mind replayed Sarah's voice through the phone. She'd asked to come over. Tonight. Now. Her voice had carried an urgency that bypassed 12 years of silence and landed in Marcus's chest like a fist. May sat across from him at the table, her arthritic fingers wrapped around the mug for warmth. Lily slept upstairs, her breathing audible through the old house's thin walls, that particular rhythm of child sleep that signaled complete surrender to unconsciousness. The clock above the stove read 9:47 p.m. You want to tell me what's eating at you before she gets here, or you want to wait until after? May's question held no judgment, just the patient certainty of someone who understood that silence often said more than speech. Marcus traced the rim of his own mug, watching steam rise and dissipate. I don't know what she wants. Yes, you do. She wants forgiveness. Question is whether you're ready to consider giving it. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted whatever response Marcus might have offered. Headlights swept across the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the sudden brightness before settling back into shadow. May stood slowly, gathering her mug and the blanket she'd draped across her shoulders. I'll be in my room, but Marcus, she paused at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hallway's darkness. That girl broke something in you when she left. Took years before I saw you smile without it looking like an apology. You give her anything tonight, you make sure it's because you want to, not because you think you owe her gentleness. Then she was gone, her footsteps careful on stairs that creaked under even her slight weight. Marcus stood and moved to the front door, arriving just as Sarah raised her hand to knock. For a moment they stood separated by wood and screen and 12 years of accumulated distance. He opened the door. Sarah wore the same clothes from the market, but she'd added a jacket against the November cold. Her hair caught the porch light, highlighting strands of gray that hadn't been there when Marcus knew her before. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than missing sleep, the kind of exhaustion that lived in bone marrow and couldn't be resolved with rest. Can I come in? Marcus stepped aside, and Sarah entered the house she'd never seen, taking in details with the observational intensity of someone trained to catalog environments. The photographs on the wall, Lily at various ages, May's wedding portrait from 40 years ago, Marcus himself at 15 with that angry, scared expression he'd worn like armor back then. The worn couch that May had owned since the Carter administration. The bookshelf crammed with paperbacks and Lily's picture books, and the legal texts Marcus had collected during the year he'd almost convinced himself he could afford law school. Your foster mother's place. It wasn't a question. Sarah had known about May, had met her twice during their relationship. Brief introductions that Marcus now realized had been deliberately superficial. He'd kept Sarah separate from the most important parts of his life, maintained boundaries he'd thought were protective, but maybe had just been prophetic. May took me in when I was 15. She bought this place 8 years ago when the bank foreclosed. I bought it from her when I could afford the down payment. It's nice. Feels like home. The observation landed awkwardly, and Sarah seemed to recognize the presumption. She turned away from her inventory of the room, meeting Marcus's eyes with visible effort. I know you didn't expect to see me again. I know coming back here wasn't... Why are you here, Sarah? The question came out harder than Marcus intended, but he didn't soften it. 12 years had earned him the right to directness. Sarah moved to the couch but didn't sit, her hands finding her pockets in a gesture Marcus remembered from arguments they'd had, that need to occupy her hands when words felt insufficient. Because you're in danger. Tom Whitmore and his crew, they're not just suspicious neighbors. They're organized. Organized how? 3 weeks ago, I started getting complaints about you. Anonymous calls to the station. Someone saying they'd seen suspicious activity at your farm. Trespassing. Possible drug involvement. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Drug involvement. I know, it's textbook. They're building a file, Marcus, trying to establish a pattern of reports that gives them legal cover for harassment. Next step is probably property damage made to look like accidents. Then it escalates. And you know this because? Because I've been documenting them for 6 months. Tom Whitmore runs a group, 8 men, all white, all convinced that Millbrook belongs to them and people like you are invading. She pulled her phone from her jacket, navigating to a folder of photographs. Tom's barn, shot from distance with telephoto lens. 8 men visible through the open door, their faces clear enough to identify. Timestamps on each image spanning October through early November. They meet every Thursday, they coordinate. Tom's brother-in-law works at the county clerk's office. He feeds them information about property transactions, who's buying where, demographic data. Marcus took the phone, scrolling through images that told a story he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. In one photo, Tom stood at what looked like a whiteboard, marker in hand, a list visible behind him. Marcus zoomed in, making out fragments. Thompson Farm, Patterson Custody, Hughes Domestic. Who are Patterson and Hughes? Black fathers who've had problems in town. Jerome Patterson lost custody of his daughter in a hearing that lasted 90 seconds. Darnell Hughes got arrested on a domestic violence charge that the prosecutor dropped 3 days later, but he'd already lost his job. Sarah reclaimed her phone, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed injustice and documented it without being able to prevent it. I've been tracking 14 cases over the past 18 months. All black fathers, all facing sudden legal problems or custody issues. The pattern's too consistent to be coincidence. Marcus sat down, the information settling into his understanding like sediment in water. He'd known Millbrook wasn't welcoming, had felt the surveillance, the barely concealed hostility, the way conversation stopped when he entered certain establishments. But knowing abstractly that racism existed was different from having its architecture mapped out in time-stamped photographs. Why are you telling me this? Because your case is coming up. What case? Sarah hesitated, and in that pause Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. Melissa filed a motion. She wants custody modification. The name hit him like a slap. Melissa. Lily's mother. The woman who'd left when their daughter was 6 months old, who'd sent exactly 3 support payments before disappearing into Nevada's vastness. who hadn't called on Lily's birthday or Christmas or any of the 1,000 ordinary days that accumulated into a childhood. Melissa, who existed in Marcus's life primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of loneliness and the lies people told themselves about love being sufficient foundation for permanence. She hasn't contacted Lily in 7 years. I know, but she filed paperwork through a lawyer, claims she's sober now, employed, wants to establish relationship with her daughter. And you know this how? Because court rotation assigned her hearing to Judge Catherine Harrington. And I've been watching Harrington's docket for 6 months. Sarah sat down on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining careful distance. Harrington has a pattern too. Black fathers in her courtroom get an average of 2.1 minutes of hearing time. White fathers get 5.8 minutes. Custody awards reflect that disparity. I've been documenting it, building a case, but I haven't figured out how to report it without getting buried by the same system that enables it. Marcus processed this information through the growing understanding that Sarah hadn't returned to Millbrook by accident. She'd come deliberately, with purpose, tracking patterns that included him before they'd ever stood on that highway shoulder. How long have you known I was here? 3 months, since I transferred. 3 months. I knew you'd bought the farm. I checked on you. Over the years, not stalking. She caught herself, recognizing how the word sounded. I wanted to make sure you were okay. And when I saw you'd moved to Millbrook, and then I saw the deputy position opening, and I'd been thinking about leaving Syracuse anyway because you couldn't handle the guilt from a safe distance anymore. The accusation hung between them, sharp and accusatory. Sarah didn't flinch from it. Yes, because I couldn't handle it anymore. Because I owed you an explanation you never got. Because I've spent 12 years wondering if I made the right choice, and 3 months ago I decided I was tired of wondering. What choice, Sarah? You left. That's not a choice. That's an exit. I was pregnant. The words landed like physical objects, solid and immovable. Marcus heard them but couldn't quite process their meaning, his brain rejecting the information as incompatible with the reality he'd constructed. When I left, I was 6 weeks pregnant. With your child. The kitchen clock ticked into the silence. Upstairs, Lily shifted in her sleep, bed springs creaking. Outside, wind moved through the bare trees with a sound like whispered arguments. Marcus's hands had found the couch cushions, fingers digging into fabric that suddenly seemed like the only solid thing in a world that had just revealed itself as built on lies. You were going to propose. I knew. I'd seen the jeweler's receipt in your jacket pocket when I was looking for your keys. $2,400, 8 months of payments. Sarah's voice had gone quiet, each word emerging carefully, like she was diffusing explosives. And I wanted to say yes. God, Marcus, I wanted to say yes so badly. But I was 6 weeks pregnant and terrified, and all I could think about was what that would mean for you. What it would mean for me. You were already carrying so much. Supporting May, saving for the farm you wanted, working 60-hour weeks at that garage while taking night classes. You were so careful about everything. How you dressed, how you spoke, where you went. I watched you calculate risk in every interaction, weigh every decision against how it might be perceived. She stood, pacing to the window, her reflection visible in the dark glass. A mixed baby, an unmarried black father, in a town where people already watched you like they were waiting for you to confirm their worst assumptions. I thought I was protecting you by leaving. Thought if I took that burden away, you could focus on building the life you deserved. That wasn't your choice to make. The words came out low and dangerous, carrying 12 years of accumulated anger. Marcus stood, needing to move, needing to do something with the fury that had ignited in his chest. You decided I couldn't handle it, decided I wasn't strong enough or capable enough or whatever enough. made the choice for both of us. I know. You don't get to know. You don't get to stand here 12 years later and tell me you were protecting me. That's not protection. That's control dressed up as concern. Sarah turned from the window, and Marcus saw tears on her face, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Not yet. Not when every muscle in his body was screaming at him to smash something, to burn something, to take the accumulated pain of 12 years and transform it into action, because fury at least felt productive in ways grief never did. What happened to the baby? The question emerged colder than Marcus felt, but he needed to know, needed the full accounting even if it destroyed him. I lost it. 8 weeks after I left. I was in a motel room in Harrisburg, working double shifts at a diner to save enough for an apartment. Started bleeding at 3 in the morning. By the time I got to the emergency room, it was over. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of containment that made her look smaller. They asked if I wanted to call anyone. The father, family, friends. I said no. Went back to the motel room alone. Laid there for 3 days before I could get up and go back to work. And all I could think was that I'd lost you and lost the baby and done it all for nothing. Marcus wanted to feel sympathy, wanted to access the compassion that May had spent years teaching him, the understanding that people made mistakes, that pain wasn't a competition, that Sarah's suffering didn't negate his own but existed parallel to it. But the fury was still too close to the surface, and beneath the fury lived a grief so massive he couldn't see its edges. You could have told me. After, when you'd lost the baby and realized you'd made a mistake, you could have called. And said what? Sorry I disappeared while pregnant with your child and then miscarried alone, but I'd like to resume our relationship? You would have hated me. I hated you anyway. The admission surprised them both. Marcus sat back down, the anger draining as quickly as it had risen, leaving behind exhaustion that made his bones feel ancient. For years, Sarah, I hated you. Constructed elaborate fantasies about seeing you again, about what I'd say, how I'd make you understand what you'd done. Then Lily came along, and I didn't have energy for hate anymore. It's expensive, holding on to that much rage. Required resources I needed for other things. He looked up at her, this woman who'd been the organizing principle of his 20s, whose absence had shaped his 30s as much as her presence had defined the years before. So I let it go. Convinced myself you were gone, and that was fine because I had Lily and May and a farm that needed work. Built a life that didn't include you. And now you're here telling me you were pregnant, and I don't know what you expect me to do with that information. Sarah moved back to the couch, sitting closer than before but still maintaining distance. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know the truth. Before Melissa's hearing, before whatever Tom's planning escalates. You deserved to know why I left, even if it doesn't change anything. When's the hearing? 3 weeks, November 30th. Marcus calculated 21 days to prepare a defense against a woman who'd abandoned their daughter, but would likely benefit from judicial bias that favored mothers, particularly white mothers whose narratives about redemption and second chances resonated with family court judges in ways that black fathers' narratives never did. 21 days to figure out how to present himself as stable and capable when his bank account held $82 and his farm ran on credit that grew more precarious each season. I could help with the case. Marcus almost laughed. You're a cop, Sarah, not a lawyer. No, but I've been documenting Harrington's bias for 6 months. I have data. Timestamps on every hearing, demographic breakdowns, custody outcomes. Evidence that establishes pattern. We could file a motion to recuse her. If you want. If you'll let me. The offer hung in the cold air between them. Marcus recognized it for what it was. Not just practical assistance, but penance. Sarah's attempt to make amends by transforming guilt into action. Part of him wanted to refuse on principle, to maintain the boundaries that had kept him safe for 12 years. But the larger part, the part that lived every day aware of how precarious his position was, how easily everything could be taken, recognized that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. I need to think about it. Sarah nodded, standing to leave. At the door, she paused. For what it's worth, you did an incredible job with Lily. She's bright and curious and confident. Everything I would have wanted for her. For our child. The possessive pronoun caught Marcus off guard. That casual claim of ownership over a person who'd never existed, whose potential had been extinguished in a Harrisburg motel room 12 years ago. He didn't correct her, just watched as she walked to her car, headlights sweeping across the farmhouse as she reversed down the driveway and disappeared into the November darkness. May emerged from her room 30 seconds after Sarah left, her timing too precise to be coincidental. She'd been listening. Marcus should have been angry about the eavesdropping, but exhaustion had filed down his capacity for additional emotion. She told you then. You knew? I suspected. Something about the way she looked at you back then. Like she was memorizing your face for when you wouldn't be there anymore. That's not how people look at each other when they're planning a future. May moved into the kitchen, refilling the kettle from the tap. Question is, what you're going to do with the information now that you have it. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, watching May perform the small rituals of preparing tea, movements so familiar they'd become invisible until you paid attention and realized how much care went into even the simplest actions. I don't know. Part of me wants to tell her to leave, that she doesn't get to come back after 12 years and expect anything. And the other part? Understands that people make choices from fear, and fear makes people cruel even when they're trying to be kind. The kettle began its low whistle, building toward the shriek that would announce water's transformation. May poured carefully, steam rising around her weathered hands. That understanding's going to cost you something. Forgiveness always does. Question is whether you think the cost is worth what you might get back. She handed him a mug, the ceramic warm against his palms. Your hearing's in 3 weeks. Sarah's offering help. Seems foolish to refuse out of pride when your daughter's future is the thing at stake. When did you get so practical? Around the same time you got so stubborn. Must have been a Thursday. May smiled, and despite everything, Marcus found himself smiling back. This woman who'd taken him in when no one else would, who'd taught him that family was built from choice rather than blood, who'd modeled a kind of fierce, pragmatic love that didn't flinch from difficulty. If May could accept Sarah's help, Marcus could at least consider it. He climbed the stairs to check on Lily, a nightly ritual that grounded him in the present even when the past threatened to overwhelm. She slept with her mouth open, arms thrown wide in the unself-conscious sprawl of childhood. The nightlight painted her face in soft amber, highlighting the gap between her teeth that would close eventually as adult teeth grew in, transforming her face into something less familiar, more distant from the baby she'd been. Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to wake her. This child who'd saved him in ways she'd never understand. Who'd given him purpose when Sarah's absence had threatened to collapse him entirely? Who'd taught him that love didn't require reciprocity to be real? That commitment could exist without guarantee? That showing up every day mattered more than the grand gestures that occupied so much cultural space? If Melissa took her, when Melissa tried to take her, because Marcus had no illusions about what the hearing would entail, Lily would lose the only stable home she'd ever known, would be uprooted from her school, her friends, May's constant presence. Melissa might have gotten sober, might have found employment, might have constructed a narrative about second chances that would resonate with Judge Harrington's worldview. But she didn't know Lily, hadn't watched her learn to read or comforted her through nightmares or helped with homework or taught her to plant seeds and watch them grow, hadn't earned the title she was claiming through biology alone. Marcus wouldn't let that happen. Couldn't let that happen, even if it meant accepting help from the woman who'd broken him 12 years ago. Tuesday arrived, wrapped in rain that turned the farm roads to mud and made driving treacherous. Marcus dropped Lily at school 20 minutes early, watching through the windshield as she ran toward the building with her backpack bouncing against her spine. Then he drove to the family court building in town, a squat brick structure that housed justice in beige rooms with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look jaundiced. His mediation cases started at 10. 3 appointments scheduled, a couple fighting over furniture division, another couple negotiating visitation for their teenage son, and Jerome Patterson's modification hearing for a custody arrangement that Jerome claimed was unjust. Marcus reviewed the files in his truck, rain drumming on the roof, preparing himself for the emotional labor of helping people find compromise when what they really wanted was vindication. The first 2 cases went smoothly. Anger and grief alchemized into agreements both parties could tolerate, if not embrace. But Jerome's case carried different weight. Marcus had seen his file, knew the history: custody hearing that lasted 90 seconds, supervised visitation only, no clear justification for the restriction. Jerome worked 50 hours a week at the mill, had maintained stable housing for 3 years, had character references from his employer and landlord. His ex-wife had remarried, moved to a better neighborhood, presented the optics of stability that family courts rewarded. Jerome arrived 10 minutes before their scheduled appointment, accompanied by his new lawyer, a young woman from legal aid who looked fresh out of law school and appropriately overwhelmed. Marcus led them to the mediation room, a space designed to feel neutral and instead felt sterile, decorated with prints of landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate you fitting us in. I know these slots are competitive." Jerome's voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting bureaucracy for years, accumulating small defeats that compounded into resignation. Marcus had heard that tone in his own voice, recognized it as the sound of people who'd learned that the system wasn't designed to serve them, but couldn't afford to stop trying. "Your modification request lists 3 grounds for increased visitation. Let's walk through them." They spent 40 minutes reviewing Jerome's case, documenting the ways he'd met every requirement the court had imposed, exceeded every expectation, transformed himself into a model of responsibility. The lawyer took notes, occasionally interjecting with legal terminology that framed Jerome's life in the language courts understood. But beneath the professional discussion, Marcus felt the current of something darker: the knowledge that evidence and logic might not matter, that Judge Harrington would see a black father and make decisions based on pattern rather than particularity. "Have you considered filing a bias complaint?" The lawyer looked up from her notepad, surprise visible on her face. Jerome's expression held more wariness than hope. "On what grounds?" "Pattern of discrimination. If we can establish that Judge Harrington systematically disadvantages black fathers, we could move for recusal. Your case gets reassigned to a different judge." The lawyer seemed to be calculating something, weighing risk against potential benefit. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Thompson. We'd need significant evidence, documented pattern across multiple cases, statistical analysis, witness testimony, the kind of thing that takes months to compile." "What if the evidence already exists?" Marcus pulled out his phone, navigating to the folder where he'd stored screenshots of Sarah's photographs, her data spreadsheets, the timeline she'd constructed. 14 cases over 18 months. Names, dates, hearing lengths, outcomes. The architecture of bias laid bare in numbers that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Jerome leaned forward, reading the screen with an intensity that made his hands shake. Where did you get this? Source who's been documenting Harrington for 6 months. Police officer who's seen the pattern and decided it needed exposure. The lawyer's professional skepticism fought with visible excitement. If this is accurate, this is grounds for immediate judicial review. Possibly misconduct charges. We'd need to verify the data, get sworn testimony from the other fathers listed here, file formal complaint with the state commission. She looked up at Marcus, something like recognition dawning. Your hearing's coming up too, isn't it? The custody modification with your ex? 3 weeks. And you're assigned to Harrington. Yes. Jerome sat back, understanding passing across his face. You're not just helping me. You're building a case for yourself. Marcus didn't deny it. Self-interest and justice weren't mutually exclusive. If he could help Jerome while simultaneously creating grounds to recuse Harrington from his own hearing, everyone won except the people who'd built their careers on systemic bias. I can connect you with the officer, Deputy Sarah Mitchell. She has all the documentation, chain of custody established, timestamps verified. She's been waiting for someone willing to go public. The lawyer was already typing notes into her tablet, fingers moving fast enough to suggest she recognized the opportunity for what it was. I'll need a few days to review the evidence, consult with supervising attorneys, figure out proper procedure. But Mr. Patterson, if you're willing to be the named complainant, we could file by end of week. Jerome looked at Marcus, then at his lawyer, then back at Marcus. What happens when we file? To me, to my daughter? Harrington gets notified of the complaint. State Judicial Commission investigates. During investigation, she's likely suspended from hearing family cases. Your modification gets reassigned to a different judge. So does mine. And Tom Whitmore? The people who've been harassing my family, making our lives hell? They just get to walk away? Marcus had been thinking about that question since Sarah's visit. Tom's group existed in the gray area between legal activism and organized harassment, their actions carefully calibrated to avoid criminal charges while still achieving their goal of making black families feel unwelcome. Complaints got filed and buried. Reports went nowhere. The system protected them because they understood how to exploit its weaknesses. Not if we document their involvement. Show that Tom's crew coordinates with Harrington's office, that there's institutional support for the bias. Then it becomes conspiracy, not just individual prejudice. The lawyer looked up sharply. That's a significant escalation, Mr. Thompson. You're talking about potential federal civil rights violations. Title VI implications. The kind of case that brings Justice Department scrutiny. Good. Maybe scrutiny's what this town needs. Jerome stood, extending his hand to Marcus. The gesture carried weight beyond professional courtesy, an acknowledgement of shared struggle, and the tentative hope that collective action might achieve what individual effort couldn't. I'm in. Whatever you need. Testimony, documentation, standing up in front of the commission and calling out every wrong thing that's been done. I'm done being quiet. Marcus shook Jerome's hand, feeling the calluses that came from mill work, the strength in fingers that had built homes and fixed cars and held a daughter who deserved better than 90-second justice. I'll have Sarah contact you by tomorrow. She'll walk you through the evidence, answer questions, help coordinate the filing. After they left, Marcus sat alone in the mediation room, staring at beige walls and feeling the weight of what he'd just set in motion. Going after Harrington meant going public, meant painting a target on his back that Tom's group would recognize and act on. It meant transforming from invisible to visible, from someone who navigated quietly to someone who challenged loudly. Everything May had taught him about survival suggested keeping his head down, working within the system, accepting small victories because demanding justice too loudly got people hurt. But Lily's face kept appearing in his mind, her gap-toothed smile. her absolute confidence that her father would protect her. Her belief, still intact despite evidence to the contrary, that the world was fundamentally fair and good people prevailed. Marcus couldn't preserve that innocence forever. The world would educate her eventually, teach her the same painful lessons every black child learned. But he could fight to make sure she wasn't taken from the only home she'd known, could stand up so she'd learn that resistance was possible, that fear didn't have to be destiny, that the systems designed to crush you could be challenged even if they couldn't be fully destroyed. His phone buzzed. Text from Sarah. Jerome's lawyer contacted me. This is good. We're building something. Thank you for trusting me. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Trust felt too generous a word for what he'd extended. Calculated risk, maybe. Pragmatic alliance. The enemy of my enemy is my temporary partner. But not trust. Trust required foundation they'd demolished 12 years ago. And 3 conversations didn't rebuild what detonation destroyed. But he texted back anyway. Meeting tomorrow? Need to coordinate strategy before we file. Her response came within seconds. My place, 7 p.m.? Or somewhere public if you prefer. Marcus considered. Meeting at Sarah's apartment carried intimacy they hadn't earned back. But meeting publicly in Millbrook meant surveillance, gossip, additional complications. He chose the third option. The farm, after Lily's asleep. Come around back. We'll talk on the porch. The school pickup line moved with the efficiency of assembly line production, each parent pulling forward in turn to collect their assigned child. Lily climbed into the truck with her backpack and a folder full of papers that teachers sent home every Tuesday, a mix of graded work and permission slips and fundraiser notices that required parental attention. Mrs. Anderson asked me to stay after class. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Mrs. Anderson, the teacher who'd penalized Lily for asking inconvenient questions about Thanksgiving mythology. What did she want? To tell me my essay about bridges was really good. She said I should enter it in the county competition. Marcus glanced at his daughter, reading her expression for signs of sarcasm or hurt. But Lily looked genuinely pleased, no apparent awareness that Mrs. Anderson's praise represented a reversal from her earlier criticism. That's great, baby. You worked hard on that essay. She said she was wrong before, that she'd been thinking about what I wrote, about how bridges have to be strong enough to hold weight but flexible enough to move with wind, and how that's like people needing to be both things at once. Marcus pulled into the farm's driveway, processing this information. Mrs. Anderson had acknowledged error, even obliquely, even through the lens of Lily's metaphor rather than direct apology. That counted for something in a town where admitting mistake felt like admitting defeat. Did she apologize? Kind of. She said sometimes grown-ups make decisions too fast without thinking about all the perspectives. Then she asked if I'd transferred to Ms. Rodriguez's class, and I said yes, and she said that was probably for the best. Lily unbuckled her seatbelt, gathering her backpack with the unconscious efficiency of repetition. Daddy, are you and Miss Sarah friends again? The question arrived without preamble, delivered in the casual tone children used when asking about weather or dinner plans. Marcus turned off the engine, buying time to formulate response. We're figuring that out. Emma's parents got divorced. She said they had to figure out how to be friends after they stopped being married. Is it like that? Something like that. Emma says her mom cries a lot. Does Miss Sarah cry? Marcus thought about Sarah's face in his kitchen, tears visible in the harsh light, about the grief she'd carried alone for 12 years, unpacking it in his living room like evidence at trial. Sometimes, people cry when they're sad or sorry or trying to explain things that don't have easy words. Lily absorbed this with the seriousness she brought to complex problems, her face scrunched in concentration. I think you should be friends. She seems nice, and she looks at you like you're important. She climbed out of the truck before Marcus could respond, running toward the house where May waited on the porch with after-school snacks and the patience to listen to an 8-year-old's detailed accounting of her day. Marcus sat in the truck a moment longer, Lily's observation echoing. "She looks at you like you're important." Children noticed things adults missed, read emotional subtexts without the interference of self-protection. If Lily saw something in Sarah's expression, Marcus couldn't dismiss it as projection or wishful thinking, which meant he had to consider the possibility that Sarah's return wasn't just about guilt or penance, but about wanting something she'd lost 12 years ago and didn't know how to ask for directly. That night, Sarah arrived at 7:14 p.m., parking near the barn so her car wasn't visible from the road. Marcus met her at the back porch, where May had left a thermos of coffee and 2 mugs that suggested she'd been coordinating with Sarah. They sat in May's old rocking chairs, watching darkness settle over fields that would stay dormant until spring. Jerome's lawyer filed the complaint this afternoon. State Judicial Commission acknowledged receipt, said they'd begin preliminary review within 10 business days. Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug, steam rising in the cold air. Harrington will be notified tomorrow. Once she knows, things are going to escalate. Tom's group will see this as provocation. Let them escalate. We have evidence. You've been documenting their meetings, their coordination. We file harassment complaints backed by actual proof instead of anonymous accusations. Marcus, they don't care about proof. They care about maintaining control. You challenge that, you become a target. He'd already become a target. The anonymous reports Sarah mentioned, the surveillance he'd felt for months, Tom's presence with Derek Mills that night. The machinery of harassment had been operating quietly, and Marcus's challenge would simply make the operation visible. My hearing's in 19 days. If Harrington's suspended, it gets reassigned. That's worth the risk. And if she's not suspended in time? If the commission moves slowly and your hearing proceeds as scheduled? Marcus had considered this scenario. Judicial investigations moved at institutional pace, measured in months rather than weeks. The complaint would establish pattern, create record, potentially result in Harrington's removal, but probably not fast enough to affect his immediate case. Then I present the evidence anyway. Show the new judge that Harrington's hearing was compromised by bias, that any decision she makes should be invalidated. Sarah set down her mug, turning to face him directly. You're gambling your daughter's future on a procedural argument. Courts don't like invalidating other judges' decisions, even when bias is proven. You could win on appeal in 2 years and still lose custody tomorrow. So what's your solution? I roll over? Let Melissa take Lily without fighting? No. You build a defense so strong that even Harrington can't rule against you. Document everything. Get character witnesses. Show that Lily's thriving here, that removing her would cause harm. Make it impossible for any judge, biased or not, to justify custody transfer. Marcus leaned back, the rocking chair creaking under his weight. Sarah's strategy was sound, defensive rather than offensive, focused on protecting what he had rather than attacking what threatened it. But defense required resources Marcus didn't possess. Character witnesses in a town where he'd deliberately kept himself isolated. Documentation of stability when his bank account balanced at $82. Proof of thriving when every month was a calculation about which bills to pay and which to defer. I need help. The admission cost something, but Sarah had earned honesty through her own vulnerability the night before. If they were building partnership, even temporary alliance, it required acknowledging limitation. That's why I'm here. She pulled a folder from her bag, spreading papers across the porch railing. Forms, templates, checklists, a roadmap for constructing a custody defense. Character witnesses. May, obviously, but also Lily's teacher, your employer at the mediation center, neighbors who've seen you with Lily, parents from her school. I'll help you contact them, draft statements, prepare them for possible testimony. Marcus scanned the list, recognizing names and feeling the weight of obligation. These people had their own lives, their own challenges. Asking them to involve themselves in his custody battle meant asking them to take sides in a town where neutrality felt safer than solidarity. Documentation, bank statements, employment records, lease agreement showing stable housing, Lily's school records demonstrating academic progress, medical records showing you've maintained her health care. Sarah pulled out a second set of papers, these ones partially completed. I started pulling public records. You'll need to fill in gaps, but this gives you foundation. And Marcus, she paused, meeting his eyes. You need to document May's health. Show that even though she's elderly and has medical issues, she's not a liability. She's support, family, the kind of intergenerational care that benefits children. May's fine. May's 73 with a heart condition. Melissa's lawyer will use that. Will suggest that you're overburdened caring for an aging parent while trying to raise a child alone. That Lily deserves a two-parent household with younger, healthier caregivers. The argument landed with painful accuracy. Marcus had worried about May's health for years, watched her slow down, seen the medications multiply, heard her breath go ragged after minimal exertion. She was fine now, mostly, but mostly fine and thriving occupied different categories, and family courts made decisions based on trajectory rather than present condition. I'll get her medical records, show her conditions are controlled, that she's stable. Good. And one more thing. Sarah hesitated, and Marcus braced himself for whatever came next. You need to prepare Lily. She's old enough that the judge might want to talk to her, ask about her preferences, assess whether she understands what's happening. Melissa's lawyer will try to paint you as controlling, as having poisoned Lily against her mother. You need Lily to be able to articulate her own desires without seeming coached. The idea of putting Lily through that kind of interrogation made Marcus's stomach clench. But Sarah was right. Family courts gave weight to children's preferences, particularly children old enough to form reasoned opinions. And Lily would be asked in chambers or through a guardian ad litem what she wanted. Her answer needed to be authentic but also strategic, innocent but also persuasive. They worked for 2 hours, Sarah walking Marcus through each component of the defense they were building. By the time she left, Marcus had a notebook full of tasks, deadlines circled in red, names to contact, and documents to gather. The roadmap felt overwhelming in its detail, but at least it existed. At least he had direction instead of just fear. May was still awake when Marcus went inside, sitting in her chair by the window with knitting that she'd barely touched. That girl's trying to make amends. I know. Question is whether you're going to let her. Marcus sat on the couch, exhaustion settling into his bones. I don't know how to forgive her, May. Don't know if I should. She made a choice that hurt me, and now she wants absolution because guilt became inconvenient. Maybe. Or maybe she's been carrying that guilt for 12 years and finally got brave enough to face it. Bravery and convenience don't have to be mutually exclusive. May set down her knitting, arthritic fingers struggling with the needles. When your Uncle James died, I was angry at him for 6 months. Angry that he'd smoked for 40 years despite my begging him to quit. Angry that he'd left me alone. Angry that his stubbornness had cost me my partner. She looked at Marcus, her eyes carrying the weight of losses he'd witnessed and losses that predated his arrival in her life. Then one day I realized the anger was just fear dressed up as righteousness. I was afraid of being alone, afraid I'd failed him, afraid his death meant our life together hadn't mattered. The anger was easier to hold than the fear, but it was eating me alive. So you forgave him? No, I let go of him. Forgiveness came later, after I'd made space for it. But first I had to stop using his memory as a weapon against myself. Marcus understood the lesson underneath May's story, recognized the invitation to examine his own anger for the fear it concealed. but knowing intellectually that forgiveness was healthier than resentment didn't make the emotional work any easier. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. Think about it. While you're thinking, let that girl help you save your daughter. You can figure out the rest after. May stood, gathering her knitting with slow, careful movements. One more thing, Marcus. That child upstairs, she's watching everything you do, learning what love looks like by watching how you treat the people who hurt you. You teach her that mistakes are unforgivable. She'll learn to hide her own. You teach her that people can change, that grace is possible. She'll learn to expect better from herself and others. She paused at the stairs. Choose what you want her to learn. The town hall meeting existed in the future, 7 months from where Marcus stood now in May's kitchen, watching frost patterns form on the window glass. But the foundation for that confrontation was being built in moments like these. November 19th, Tuesday morning. Lily eating cereal while Marcus reviewed the custody defense documents Sarah had compiled. Each checkmark represented work completed, gaps filled, a life reduced to bureaucratic evidence that Marcus Thompson deserved to keep raising his daughter. Character witnesses. Secured. May, obviously. Mrs. Rodriguez, Lily's new teacher, who'd written 3 paragraphs about academic improvement and emotional stability. Carl Henderson from the farmer's market, who'd called Marcus directly to apologize for his suspicion and offer testimony about Marcus's integration into community life. Even Jerome Patterson had volunteered, though Sarah had advised against it. Too much association with the judicial complaint could hurt more than help. Financial documentation. Partial. Bank statements showed consistent deposits from mediation work, but also revealed the precarious math of survival. The mortgage payment automated on the 1st of each month. Utilities fluctuating with seasonal demands. Groceries purchased with careful attention to unit pricing and sales. No discretionary spending, no savings buffer, no evidence of the financial stability that family courts equated with good parenting. Medical records for Lily. Complete. Vaccinations current, annual checkups attended, dental care maintained despite Marcus's own deferred health care. The pediatrician had included a note about Marcus's attentiveness, his questions about developmental milestones, his follow-through on recommendations. Small victories documented in clinical language. May's health documentation. Complicated. The cardiologist's report used terms like managed condition and stable with medication, but also noted progressive decline consistent with age and increased monitoring recommended. Melissa's lawyer would seize on those phrases, transform medical reality into narrative about burden and risk. "Daddy, you're not eating." Lily's observation pulled Marcus back to the immediate moment. His own cereal had gone soggy in the bowl, milk-logged flakes that looked like papier-mâché. "Not hungry this morning, baby. Are you worried about something?" Children developed this radar, learned to read adult anxiety through subtle cues that bypassed verbal communication. Marcus had tried to shield Lily from the custody battle's details, but she lived in the same house, heard the phone conversations, watched him compile documents late into the night. "Just thinking about work. Lot of cases this week." Lily accepted this explanation with the grace of a child who'd learned not to push when adults deployed deflection. She finished her cereal, rinsed the bowl without being asked, gathered her backpack with the efficiency of routine. On the drive to school, she chattered about the science fair project she was planning, something involving plant growth and light exposure. And Marcus made appropriate sounds of encouragement while his mind calculated timelines and worst-case scenarios. 3 weeks until the hearing. 19 days to transform his life into a presentation compelling enough to overcome judicial bias and maternal claims. 19 days to prove that a black single father living paycheck to paycheck with an elderly foster mother qualified as stability worth preserving. The Judicial Commission's response to Jerome's complaint had arrived via certified mail the previous afternoon. Preliminary review indicated sufficient grounds for investigation. Judge Catherine Harrington would be interviewed within 10 business days. Pending investigation results, the commission would determine appropriate action, which could range from reprimand to suspension to recommendation for removal. 10 business days meant 2 weeks minimum. The hearing would proceed before any decision materialized. Marcus had known this, had prepared himself for the timeline's inadequacy. But knowing intellectually and experiencing emotionally occupied different territories. Sarah had texted that morning. Harrington knows about the complaint. Derek told me she's angry, feeling targeted. Watch for retaliation. Retaliation could take infinite forms. Rushed hearing procedures, hostile questioning, rulings that exceeded judicial discretion but fell short of reversible error, or something less direct. Pressure on Marcus's employers, scrutiny of his mediation cases, whispered suggestions that made people question whether association with him carried professional risk. The mediation center occupied a converted house near the courthouse, its rooms decorated in colors that psychologists claimed promoted calm. Marcus's mourning cases proceeded normally, a property dispute resolved through grudging compromise, a support modification negotiated within state guidelines. But during lunch break, his supervisor Rita Chen called him into her office. Rita had hired Marcus 3 years ago, impressed by his natural facility for de-escalation and his nuanced understanding of how power dynamics shaped negotiation. She was 60, Chinese-American, carried herself with the exhausted competence of someone who'd spent 4 decades navigating systems designed to exclude her. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. The preamble activated Marcus's threat detection systems. Rita's directness usually bypassed preliminaries, got straight to substance. When she used softening language, bad news followed. I'm being honest. Are you involved in a complaint against Judge Harrington? Marcus calculated responses, weighing honesty against self-protection. But Rita deserved better than evasion. I'm supporting a complaint filed by another father, Jerome Patterson. His case demonstrated clear bias. And your own hearing is scheduled in front of Harrington. It was. If she's suspended, it'll be reassigned. Rita leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming on the desk in rhythm that suggested internal debate. I got a call this morning from someone at the courthouse, not identifying themselves officially but implying they had authority, asking questions about your employment here, your performance, whether we'd had complaints. What did you tell them? That your performance has been exemplary, that client satisfaction ratings put you in the top 10% of mediators statewide, that we've received 0 complaints about your conduct. She met Marcus's eyes with an intensity that demanded reciprocal honesty. But Marcus, you need to understand what you're up against. Harrington's been on the bench for 18 years. She has relationships throughout the courthouse, the county administration, local legal community. You're challenging someone with institutional power and the kind of connections that can make your life difficult in ways you won't see coming. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're risking everything. Your custody case, your employment, and your reputation, on the principle that the system should be fair. And I admire principle, Marcus. But principle doesn't pay your mortgage when you lose your job. The warning carried genuine concern rather than threat. Rita was protecting him and the center simultaneously, acknowledging that sometimes individual justice and institutional survival conflicted. Are you firing me? No. But I'm telling you that if this gets messier, if Harrington's allies start applying pressure, I may have limited ability to shield you. This center operates on county contracts and grant funding. We can't afford to be seen as political. Marcus absorbed this information, adding it to the growing list of potential consequences. Losing mediation income would crater his custody defense, eliminate the employment stability that formed one pillar of his case. But backing down now meant abandoning Jerome and the 13 other fathers whose cases Sarah had documented. meant accepting that institutional bias was permanent, that challenging injustice carried costs too high to pay. I understand. I'm not asking you to take sides, but I'm not stopping. Rita nodded slowly, her expression mixing respect and resignation. I figured you'd say that. For what it's worth, I hope you win, both cases. But Marcus, be careful. The system protects itself first. It'll sacrifice you without hesitation if that's what preservation requires. 5 days later, November 17th, Sunday evening, Marcus met Sarah at the diner on Route 9, a neutral location where their presence together wouldn't trigger immediate gossip. The diner occupied that peculiar American space of compulsory egalitarianism, where factory workers and lawyers ate at adjacent booths and the coffee was uniformly terrible, regardless of customer demographics. Sarah had already claimed a corner booth when Marcus arrived, papers spread across the table like battlefield maps. She'd ordered him coffee without asking, remembered after 12 years that he took it black, no sugar. The gesture felt simultaneously thoughtful and presumptuous, care entangled with assumption. Rita called you in. It wasn't a question. Sarah had been tracking ripples from the complaint, documenting retaliation attempts with the same thoroughness she'd documented Harrington's bias. Warned me that courthouse allies might apply pressure. She's not going to fire me, but she can't promise protection if things escalate. They're going to escalate. I heard from Derek. We're not speaking, but he made sure that I heard through intermediaries that Tom's group is planning something. No details, just that they see your complaint as declaration of war. Marcus sipped the terrible coffee, its bitterness matching his mood. Let them plan. We've got evidence. We've got Jerome willing to testify. We've got 14 cases documented over 18 months. That's not opinion. That's pattern. Pattern that challenges how this town has operated for decades. You think Tom's the only one invested in maintaining the status quo? Every white father who benefited from Harrington's bias, every lawyer who used that bias to win cases, every administrator who buried complaints, they all have reasons to want you silenced. Sarah pulled a photograph from her stack of papers, sliding it across the table. Tom's barn, shot from distance, showing 8 men in what appeared to be heated discussion. Timestamp indicated the photo was taken 2 days ago, after news of the judicial complaint had circulated. They're planning something, Marcus. I can feel it. The energy's different. They're not just meeting to complain anymore. They're strategizing. Marcus studied the photograph, recognizing faces he'd seen around town. The hardware store owner, the guy who ran the auto parts shop, men whose businesses depended on local goodwill, who had everything to lose if Millbrook's demographics shifted toward diversity. Can you get audio? Wire the barn? Not legally. I'd need a warrant which requires probable cause of criminal activity. Meeting to be racist isn't illegal. Acting on it is until they do something concrete. My hands are tied. The frustration in Sarah's voice mirrored what Marcus felt. Documentation created record but didn't prevent harm. By the time you had admissible evidence of conspiracy, the conspiracy had usually already caused damage. What about protective measures? Can you increase patrol past my farm, keep eyes on Tom's movements? I can drive by more frequently on my shifts. But Marcus, I'm one deputy in a department of 12. Derek's my partner half the time, and he's sympathetic to Tom's worldview even if he doesn't participate directly. Sheriff Hayes is decent but cautious. He won't approve surveillance without evidence of imminent threat. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, though the nearest occupied booth was 3 removed from theirs. I've been documenting everything I can, building a federal case. Pattern of harassment, civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional protections. If we can establish that Tom's group operates with tacit approval from law enforcement and judicial systems, we've got grounds for Justice Department involvement. That takes years. Which is why I'm also focusing on the immediate, keeping you and Lily safe for the next 3 weeks. After your hearing, after Jerome's case resolves, after the commission makes its determination, then we go federal. But first we have to get you through November without Tom's group escalating to violence. The word hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Violence had always been implicit in their discussion of Tom's activities, but Sarah's explicit naming transformed abstract threat into concrete possibility. Men who believed their town was being invaded didn't stop at phone calls and anonymous complaints. History taught that lesson repeatedly, bodies stacking up in service of white supremacy's perpetuation. "I'm not leaving. I'm not running. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to be strategic. Don't drive alone at night. Keep your phone charged and on you always. Tell me where you're going when you leave the farm. Let me help keep you alive, Marcus." The intimacy in her voice bypassed his defenses, landed in the soft tissue beneath armor. She wasn't just documenting his case or building her federal complaint. She was protecting him, motivated by guilt maybe, but also by something that resembled care, possibly even love, though that word felt too large and complicated to examine directly. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Sarah sat back, her hands wrapping around her coffee cup, though the liquid had gone cold. "Because 12 years ago I made a choice based on fear, and that choice hurt you in ways I'll never be able to fully repair. But maybe I can make different choices now. Maybe I can be the person who stays instead of the person who runs. That has to count for something." "It counts. I'm just trying to figure out for what." They sat in silence while the diner's ambient noise filled the space between them. Silverware clinking against plates, conversations bleeding together into undifferentiated sound, the coffee machine hissing steam like a mechanical animal. Marcus thought about May's question from the previous night. What did he want Lily to learn about forgiveness? About grace? About whether people could change? "I need to tell Lily about the hearing, about Melissa, about the possibility that things might change." Sarah nodded, understanding the vulnerability in that admission. "How much are you going to tell her?" "Enough that she's not blindsided, not so much that she's terrified." That's a narrow space to navigate. Everything about raising a black child in America is a narrow space to navigate. The observation landed with weight Sarah couldn't fully access, living as she did in the relative safety of whiteness. She could understand intellectually, could document and support an ally, but she'd never have to teach her hypothetical daughter how to make herself smaller in public spaces, how to read threat in casual interactions, how to perform non-threatening competence, because survival depended on managing other people's fear. "Will you let me be there when you tell her?" Marcus considered. Sarah's presence would add complexity to an already difficult conversation, but it might also provide comfort, demonstrate that the adults in Lily's life were coordinated rather than fractured, united in protecting her even when the mechanics of that protection remained unclear. "Thursday evening. Come for dinner. We'll tell her together, the three of us." Sarah's gratitude was visible, relief mixed with apprehension. She gathered her papers, organizing them into folders labeled with the bureaucratic precision of someone who understood that documentation mattered more than truth when institutions decided outcomes. "Marcus, one more thing. I talked to my contact at Legal Aid, the lawyer representing Jerome and helping coordinate the judicial complaint. She suggested we might want to file a companion motion for your case, requesting change of venue, arguing that pre-trial publicity about Harrington's bias makes it impossible for you to get fair hearing in this county. Would that work?" "Maybe. It's a long shot, and it adds another procedural layer. But it buys time. Delays your hearing until after the commission makes its determination. Gives us opportunity to establish pattern in Jerome's case first. Or it looks like I'm running scared, trying to dodge Harrington rather than face her directly." Sarah considered this, her expression troubled. "There's truth in that. And Melissa's lawyer will absolutely frame it that way, that you're so worried about losing on merit that you're grasping at technicalities. But Marcus, if you go forward with Harrington presiding and she rules against you, appealing takes months or years. Lily could be in Nevada by then. integrated into Melissa's household enough that disruption becomes its own argument against reversal. The calculus was impossible. Strategy that might preserve his parental rights could also undermine the moral authority of his challenge to judicial bias. But strategy that prioritized principles over tactics could cost him everything. Let me think about it. Talk to May, see what she counsels. I'll let you know by Friday. They parted in the parking lot, Sarah's hand briefly touching Marcus's arm in a gesture that felt both tentative and deliberate. Then she drove toward town while Marcus headed home, headlights cutting through darkness that seemed to press against the truck's windows. May was waiting on the porch despite the cold, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She'd developed this habit recently, positioning herself as sentinel whenever Marcus came home after dark. Vigilance born from love and fear in equal measure. That girl staying for dinner Thursday? How did you— I've been alive 73 years, Marcus. You think I can't recognize when people are planning to have difficult conversations? You get a particular look on your face, like you're preparing for battle even when you're trying to be casual about it. Marcus climbed the porch steps, settling into the rocking chair beside May's. The farm spread before them in darkness, interrupted only by the barn's security light and the distant glow of Millbrook's commercial district. We're going to tell Lily about the custody hearing, about Melissa wanting her back. Sarah thought it would help if we presented a united front, showed Lily that the adults are coordinated. United front implies united. You two figured out what you are to each other yet? We're people with shared history who are temporarily aligned by circumstance. May's laugh carried no humor. That's the saddest description of relationship I've heard in 40 years of listening to people explain themselves. Shared history and circumstance. That's what strangers have. You and that girl, you've got something messier and more valuable. Question is whether you're brave enough to name it. Marcus didn't respond immediately. The rocking chair moved beneath him, its rhythm hypnotic and grounding. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, the sound lonely and certain. I don't know how to trust her again, May. She left when I needed her most, made decisions about my life without consulting me. How do I build anything lasting with someone who's already demonstrated they'll disappear when things get hard? You don't build it on trust you don't have. You build it on trust you're willing to develop, piece by careful piece. Trust isn't a prerequisite for relationship, Marcus. It's the product of relationship that works. She shifted in her chair, arthritis visible in the careful way she moved. That girl hurt you. No question. But she also came back, even though coming back meant facing you and May and all the damage she caused. That takes different kind of courage than staying ever did. Leaving's easy when you're scared. Returning's hard when you're ashamed. So I should forgive her because she finally got brave enough to own her mistakes? No. You should forgive her because holding on to anger is using up resources you need for other things, like keeping your daughter, like building a life worth living. Forgiveness isn't gift to her. It's gift to yourself. May stood, gathering her blanket with slow determination. But you're going to figure that out on your own timeline, not mine. Just don't take so long that you miss the opportunity. Chances don't usually announce themselves. They just appear and disappear based on whether you were paying attention. Thursday, November 21st, 2 days after Marcus's confrontation with Rita Chen, arrived cold and bright, the kind of November day that made winter feel inevitable. Marcus picked Lily up from school at the normal time, watching her navigate social dynamics with an ease that still surprised him. She hugged 2 friends goodbye, waved at 3 others, climbed into the truck with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who felt secure in her place in the world. That security was what Marcus most feared losing, not the custody arrangement itself. That was legal construct, paperwork that could be modified. But Lily's fundamental trust that the world made sense, that adults could be relied upon, that home was stable rather than provisional. Children who lost that trust early learned to protect themselves through emotional distance, became adults who struggled to believe in permanence. "Miss Sarah's coming for dinner?" "Yes. How did you know?" "Grandma May told me. She said we're having pot roast because that's company food and Miss Sarah counts as company." Marcus filed away May's characterization. Company, not family. The distinction mattered. At home, May had indeed prepared pot roast, the house filling with smells that Marcus associated with Sunday dinners and holidays, occasions that warranted effort beyond weeknight efficiency. Sarah arrived at 6 carrying a pie from the bakery in town, her contribution to the meal an acknowledgement that she understood the evening's significance. They ate with careful normalcy, conversation touching on safe topics. Lily's science fair project, May's knitting, Sarah's work stories edited for child-appropriate content. But the adults' tension was palpable, anticipation building toward the conversation that would reshape Lily's understanding of her immediate future. After dinner, after dishes were cleared and pie was served, Marcus suggested they sit in the living room. Lily settled onto the couch between Marcus and Sarah, May taking her chair by the window where she could observe without centering herself in the discussion. "Baby, we need to talk to you about something important." Lily's expression shifted, childhood's natural anxiety activating. She looked from Marcus to Sarah and back, calculating threat level from adult faces. "Did I do something wrong?" "No. No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. This isn't about you. It's about adults making decisions that affect you." Marcus had rehearsed this conversation with Sarah the previous night, scripting language that balanced honesty with protection. But sitting here with his daughter's worried eyes on him, the script felt inadequate. "You know your mother, your birth mother, Melissa, hasn't been part of your life for a long time. She left when I was a baby because she couldn't take care of me." Lily's version of events had been constructed from fragments Marcus provided over years, shaped into narrative that protected her from feeling rejected. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She'd made a difficult choice because she wasn't ready for parenthood. "That's right, and we haven't heard from her in a long time. But recently she contacted a lawyer. She wants to be part of your life now." Lily absorbed this information with visible confusion. "Like visits? Like Emma's dad who lives in Buffalo and she sees on weekends?" "Maybe like that. We don't know exactly what she wants yet. But there's going to be a hearing, like a meeting with a judge, where we talk about what's best for you." "Can I stay here, with you and Grandma May?" The question contained all the fear Marcus had hoped to avoid. Lily had translated hearing and judge into their practical meaning, adults discussing whether she'd be taken from the only home she'd known. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but clear. "We're going to fight for you to stay here, Lily. Your dad and I, we're working together to show the judge that this is where you belong, that you're safe and loved and thriving." "But what if the judge says I have to go with Melissa? What if I don't get to choose?" Marcus pulled Lily close, feeling her small body rigid with anxiety. "The judge listens to what kids want, especially kids your age who can explain their feelings. You'll get to tell the judge that you want to stay here if that's what you want." "It is. I want to stay here. This is my home. You're my dad." The possessive pronouns carried weight beyond grammar. Lily was claiming her place, asserting identity built from 8 years of daily care rather than biological connection. "Then we'll tell the judge that. And we'll show them all the reasons you should stay. Your school, your friends, your family here, how well you're doing. We've got people who will testify, who will tell the judge that you're happy and healthy and loved." Lily pulled back slightly, looking at Marcus with an expression that seemed older than 8 years. "Are you scared?" The question demanded honesty. Marcus could offer reassurance, downplay his own fear to protect Lily from adult anxiety. Or he could model the truth that fear and courage weren't mutually exclusive. "Yes, I'm scared." Because I love you more than anything in the world, and the idea of you not being here every day terrifies me. But being scared doesn't mean we stop fighting. It means we fight harder." Sarah added quietly, "Your dad's the bravest person I know, Lily, and he's not facing this alone. We're all fighting for you. Your dad, Grandma May, me, and a lot of other people who care about you." Lily seemed to consider this, her fear gradually shifting toward something that resembled determination. "When is the hearing?" "November 30th, 9 days from now. That's after Thanksgiving." The observation felt significant, though Marcus couldn't immediately articulate why. Then he understood. Lily was calculating time in reference to holidays, anchoring uncertainty to familiar rhythms. After Thanksgiving meant after turkey and pie and the traditions that marked seasonal transition. The hearing existed in a future that still contained normalcy, hadn't yet collapsed into crisis. "Yes, so we're going to have Thanksgiving like we always do. We're going to be together and be grateful for each other. And then we're going to go to the hearing and tell the truth." What if the truth isn't enough? The question contained wisdom beyond Lily's years, recognition that justice and outcome didn't always align. Marcus looked at Sarah, finding in her expression the same helplessness he felt. "Then we appeal. We keep fighting. We don't give up on each other, ever. That's what family means. It means you don't quit even when the system says you should." May's voice came from her chair, quiet but certain. "That's bigger than the sky right there, Lily. Bigger than fear. Bigger than one judge's decision. Family means you belong, and belonging can't be taken away just because someone with power says so." Lily looked at her grandmother, then back at Marcus and Sarah. "Okay, I'll tell the judge I want to stay. And if they don't listen, we'll keep fighting until they do." She said it with such conviction that Marcus almost believed the world worked that way, that determination and truth were sufficient. But he'd lived long enough to know better, to understand that the system crushed people precisely because they believed in its fairness, right up until it destroyed them. After Lily went to bed, May retiring shortly after with visible exhaustion, Marcus and Sarah sat on the porch again. The temperature had dropped below freezing, their breath visible in the darkness. "She's remarkable. You've raised a remarkable human." "We've raised her, May and I. She's who she is because May taught me how to parent, how to love without conditions, how to show up every day even when I was exhausted or scared or convinced I was failing." Sarah nodded, accepting the correction. "I've been thinking about the venue change motion, the one legal aid suggested. And I think we file it. Not because I'm afraid of Harrington specifically, but because I want the strongest possible defense. If that means delay, if that means appearing strategic rather than principled, I can live with it. What I can't live with is losing Lily because I prioritized optics over tactics." Marcus had been moving toward this conclusion for days, but articulating it crystallized the decision into action. "I'll call the lawyer tomorrow, get the motion drafted and filed by Monday. That gives us until the hearing to argue for continuance." "Melissa's lawyer will oppose." "Of course, but we've got grounds, documented bias, pending investigation, inability to secure fair hearing. Judge might grant delay, even if they don't change venue." Sarah shifted in her chair, the wood creaking against her weight. "There's something else I need to tell you. About Tom." The shift in her tone activated Marcus's alert systems. "I can't prove this yet, so it's not officially part of any investigation, but I think Tom's planning something for Thanksgiving. I've been monitoring his social media accounts. He's not sophisticated enough to make them private, and he's been posting about taking our town back and showing outsiders they're not welcome. That's rhetoric. He posts that kind of thing constantly." "Yes, but the timing's different. And 2 days ago, he posted asking his followers to stay tuned for a demonstration of community values on Thursday evening, Thanksgiving night. Marcus processed the implications. Thanksgiving meant the courthouse would be closed, law enforcement minimally staffed, most families occupied with private celebrations. Perfect timing for action that required cover of distraction. What kind of demonstration? That's what I can't figure out. It could be symbolic. Maybe they picket the courthouse, display banners, make their opposition visible but legal. Or it could be something directed at you specifically. Your farm, your property. You think they'd come here? On Thanksgiving? I think Tom sees your complaint as personal attack, and men like him retaliate when they feel attacked. Plus, there's symbolic resonance. Thanksgiving as reclamation narrative, taking back what they believe was stolen. It fits his worldview. Marcus stood, pacing the porch's length while adrenaline sharpened his thinking. So what do we do? I'm not leaving. I'm not spending Thanksgiving hiding because Tom might show up. No, but we could arrange for increased presence. I'll coordinate with Sheriff Hayes, get patrol cars driving past every 30 minutes. Jerome said he'd help. He and 3 other fathers from the complaint could be here, visible support that also serves as deterrence. You're talking about turning Thanksgiving dinner into a defensive operation. I'm talking about being prepared. If Tom doesn't show, we've wasted nothing. If he does show and we're ready, we minimize potential damage. The logic was sound even as the reality felt absurd. Marcus had spent 8 years trying to build a life characterized by normal, daily routines, seasonal celebrations, the unremarkable rhythms of parenting and farm work. Now, even Thanksgiving required tactical planning, vigilance substituting for gratitude. Fine. Coordinate with Jerome. Tell him he and whoever wants to come should arrive by 4. We'll have enough food. May always cooks for an army anyway. But Sarah, he turned to face her directly. If they come, if Tom shows up here looking for confrontation, I need you to get Lily and May out. Don't engage, don't try to mediate, just get them safe while I deal with it. Marcus, I'm a deputy. I can't just leave you to face. You can if protecting my daughter and my foster mother is the priority. I'm not asking for permission, Sarah. I'm telling you what I need. Can you do that? She met his eyes, and Marcus saw her struggle between professional duty and personal commitment. Then she nodded. Yes, if they come, I'll get Lily and May out. But Marcus, you don't face them alone. Jerome will be here, other fathers. You'll have backup. I don't want backup. I want my daughter safe. You can have both. They stood in the cold, their breath mingling in the space between them. Marcus thought about May's question from earlier in the week. What did he want Lily to learn about grace and forgiveness? But maybe the more immediate lesson was about courage, about standing firm when the world demanded you disappear, about building community from shared threat because isolation was exactly what white supremacy required to function. Stay. The word emerged before Marcus fully processed its meaning. Tonight. Stay here tonight. Sleep on the couch or in the guest room if it's not too presumptuous to call May's sewing room a guest room. But stay. Sarah's surprise was visible. Why? Because I'm tired of doing this alone. Because you're right that I need backup. Because, he stopped, searching for words adequate to complexity. Because letting you in might be the hardest and most important thing I do. And I might as well start now, rather than waiting for perfect conditions that will never arrive. Sarah's hand found his, fingers cold, but grip certain. Okay, I'll stay. They stood there for another moment, connected by touch and shared fear and something that wasn't quite trust but approached it from a different angle. Then they went inside, Marcus showing Sarah where May kept extra blankets, the bathroom supplies she'd need, the guest room that functioned as storage but could accommodate a person if you moved the fabric bolts and sewing machine. Later, Lying in his own bed with the house silent around him, Marcus thought about thresholds, the space between running and staying, between fear and courage, between the person Sarah had been 12 years ago and the person she was becoming now, shaped by consequences she'd spent a decade avoiding. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a single decision but a series of small choices, accumulated over time until they transformed into something resembling grace. Maybe trust rebuilt itself in increments too subtle to notice until you looked back and realized the foundation had solidified while you were occupied with survival. Or maybe he was romanticizing because loneliness had its own gravity, pulling people together through proximity and shared struggle rather than genuine connection. Marcus didn't know, but he was willing to find out, willing to risk additional hurt if it meant not facing the next 9 days alone. Thanksgiving morning, November 28th, exactly 9 days before the custody hearing, arrived gray and cold, clouds hanging low enough to make the sky feel oppressive. May woke early to start the turkey, her movements in the kitchen audible through the old house's thin walls. Marcus found Sarah at the kitchen table, already dressed, nursing coffee that May had made strong enough to strip paint. Morning. May's already interrogated me about my intentions. Marcus winced. What did she ask? Whether I was planning to hurt you again. Whether I understood what was at stake. Whether I was prepared to stay even when staying got difficult. What did you tell her? That I couldn't promise perfect, but I could promise present. That I'd already hurt you once and had no intention of repeating that mistake. That staying was exactly what I came back to learn how to do. May emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. And I told her that was good enough for now, but we'd revisit the conversation if she showed signs of running. Can't unbreak what's broken, but you can at least stop breaking new things. She looked at Marcus with expression that mixed sternness and affection. Your girl's going to be awake soon. You want to tell her about the extra guests for dinner before or after she comes downstairs? Before. Let me handle it. Marcus climbed to Lily's room, finding her already awake and reading in bed. Thursday morning meant no school, the luxury of slow start to the day that Thanksgiving permitted. Morning, baby. We're going to have some extra people for dinner today. Friends who are helping with the hearing. Is that okay? Lily considered this, her expression suggesting she understood there was more to the story. The people who are fighting with you? For me? That's right. Jerome and some other dads who've had similar problems. They're coming to be together, to be family, even though we're not related by blood. That's good. Family should be together on Thanksgiving. Her easy acceptance reminded Marcus that children possessed an elasticity adults had trained out of themselves. Lily didn't question why strangers were joining their celebration, didn't demand explanations about strategic defense or potential threats. She simply accepted that family expanded to include whoever showed up and stayed. Jerome arrived at 3:47 p.m. with his daughter Jasmine and 2 other fathers Marcus recognized from court mediations, Darnell Hughes and Malik Johnson. Each brought food despite Marcus's insistence that May had prepared enough: sweet potato casserole, collard greens, a chess pie that looked homemade. Sarah let them in, her uniform visible under her coat, the deliberate message that law enforcement supported Marcus rather than threatened him. They ate at 4:30, the dining table extended with leaves May hadn't used in years, chairs borrowed from the church basement to accommodate everyone. 10 people crowded around food that May had been preparing since dawn, the turkey golden and steaming, sides arranged with care that spoke to celebration rather than fear. Before eating, May asked for grace. Marcus expected traditional blessing, gratitude for food and family, acknowledgement of abundance. But May surprised him. We're grateful today for this food and this gathering, but we're also grateful for the courage it takes to fight when the system says you should accept. We're grateful for the people who show up when showing up carries risk. We're grateful that love is bigger than law, that family transcends biology, that belonging can't be legislated away even when power tries. She paused, her voice strengthening. And we're asking for protection, for this house and these people, for wisdom to know when to stand firm and when to bend, for justice not just in courtrooms but in hearts, for the strength to be bigger than the fear that wants to make us small. Bigger than the sky, Lily whispered, and several adults echoed the phrase. They ate with the particular intensity of people who understood that shared meals were both ordinary and sacred, that breaking bread together created bonds that transcended individual interest. Lily charmed everyone with stories about school and science fair preparations, her easy confidence a testament to the security Marcus and May had built around her. Jasmine responded with her own school stories, the two girls finding common ground in the universal concerns of 8-year-olds. The men talked about custody battles and court experiences, sharing strategies and frustrations with the weary camaraderie of soldiers comparing war stories. Sarah mostly listened, contributing only when questions about legal procedure required clarification. Marcus watched her navigate the gathering, this white woman in a room of black families united by shared experience of institutional bias. She didn't try to center herself, didn't claim alliance as credential, just stayed present and useful, offering refills and clearing plates, making herself part of the machinery that enabled gathering to function. At 6:30, as May and Sarah cleared dessert plates, Jerome's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, his expression darkening. Tom just posted on social media. Demonstration starting at 7 p.m. Real Americans showing what community means. Sarah was already moving, pulling her radio from her coat. Sheriff Hayes, this is Mitchell. I need immediate backup at the Thompson Farm, 347 County Route 12. Potential threat of harassment, possibly coordinated group action. Request 2 units, ETA as soon as possible. The radio crackled. Mitchell, we're short-staffed for the holiday. I've got 1 unit available, ETA 20 minutes. Copy. I'll maintain position until backup arrives. She turned to the room, her voice shifting into command mode. Everyone who's not family, I need you to move your vehicles to block the driveway entrance. Create physical barrier so vehicles can't drive up to the house. Darnell, Malik, you're biggest. You stay with me outside, visible presence. Jerome, you stay inside with May and the girls. Marcus moved to the window, watching headlights appear at the end of the long driveway. 3 trucks, moving slowly, deliberate. Tom's red Ford in the lead. The vehicles stopped at the entrance, blocked by Jerome's car and Malik's SUV positioned bumper to bumper across the narrow opening. Doors opened. 8 men climbed out, their faces visible in the headlights. Tom stood at the front, arms crossed, the posture of a man who believed his presence alone constituted authority. Sarah stepped onto the porch, Marcus beside her. Darnell and Malik flanked them, forming a wall of quiet resistance. The cold air carried voices across the distance. This is private property, Tom. You're trespassing. Sarah's voice held the flat authority of law enforcement, amplified by the badge visible on her chest. We're here to deliver a message. Real Americans don't want your kind. Chitin, sheriff's en route. You have 2 minutes to leave before I arrest you for trespassing and intimidation. Tom's response was drowned out by the sound of an approaching siren. Sheriff Hayes's patrol car turned onto the property, lights painting everything red and blue. Tom's group hesitated, the choreography of intimidation collapsing when met with actual consequences. Hayes stepped out, hand resting on his belt, not threatening, but ready. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you once to leave this property. If you refuse, you'll spend Thanksgiving night in lockup. The men looked at Tom, waiting for direction. But Tom's authority had evaporated in the presence of real power. He climbed back into his truck without a word, the others following. 3 sets of taillights disappeared down the road, leaving only silence and the fading smell of exhaust. Marcus exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Thank you. Hayes nodded. Mitchell's been keeping me updated on the situation. We'll file harassment charges tomorrow. Between that and the judicial complaint, Tom's going to have bigger problems than your farm." The sheriff left. The fathers stayed another hour, long enough to ensure no return visit, then departed with promises to stay in touch. Sarah remained, helping May clean while Marcus tucked Lily into bed. "Are the bad men gone?" "Yes, baby, they're gone." "Did you stand up to them, like you said?" Marcus smoothed her hair, his hand steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "We all did, together. That's what family does. Bigger than the sky?" "Bigger than the sky." 6 days passed in a blur of preparation. Marcus refined his testimony, reviewed documents, rehearsed answers to questions he hoped wouldn't be asked. The venue change motion was denied, no surprise, but Sarah's documentation had been forwarded to the Judicial Commission, which meant Harrington knew she was being watched. November 30th arrived cold and clear. Marcus drove to the courthouse with May and Lily, Sarah following in her patrol car. The building looked exactly as it had every other time Marcus had entered for mediation work, but today it felt different. Today, it would decide his future. The hearing room was smaller than Marcus expected. Judge Michael Torres presided, not Harrington, who'd been temporarily reassigned pending investigation. Torres was younger, sharper, his eyes carrying the alertness of someone who read every document thoroughly. Melissa sat across the aisle with her lawyer, a woman in an expensive suit who radiated the confidence of someone who'd won these cases before. Melissa looked different, healthier, sober, probably, but still a stranger to the daughter she'd abandoned. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. Melissa's lawyer presented rehabilitation documentation, employment records, character witnesses from Nevada, a narrative of redemption that would have been compelling if it weren't built on 7 years of absence. Then it was Marcus's turn. May testified about family structure, about Lily's happiness and security. Mrs. Rodriguez described academic improvement and emotional stability. Carl Henderson, in a moment that surprised Marcus, spoke about watching Marcus integrate into community life, raising his daughter with dignity despite facing obstacles that would have broken lesser men. Sarah testified last, her data on Harrington's bias adding context without dominating. The message was clear. This case required scrutiny, not rubber stamping. Finally, Judge Torres asked to speak with Lily in chambers. 10 minutes. When she emerged, her hand found Marcus's immediately. Torres returned to the bench, his expression unreadable. "I've reviewed all submitted evidence and heard testimony from both parties. This is a case about what serves the child's best interest, not what validates parental redemption." He looked at Melissa directly. "Ms. Thompson, your rehabilitation is commendable. Your desire to reconnect with your daughter is understandable, but 7 years of absence creates a bond that can't be replaced by recent good intentions. Lily has a stable home, a strong family structure, and a father who has demonstrated consistent, loving care." Torres shifted his gaze to Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, I'm denying the modification request. You retain full custody. Ms. Thompson is granted supervised visitation 2 Saturdays per month to be arranged through family services. We'll review this arrangement in 6 months." The gavel came down. Marcus felt Lily's arms around his waist, felt May's hand on his shoulder, heard Sarah's quiet yes from behind him. Melissa was crying, her lawyer already gathering papers to leave. Outside the courthouse, Jerome waited with news of his own. His modification had been granted. Full joint custody, effective immediately. "They're investigating 4 more cases this week. Your complaint started something, Marcus." 7 months later, June. The Millbrook Town Hall was packed beyond capacity. Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at faces he recognized. Tom in handcuffs, awaiting trial for harassment and conspiracy. Harrington, whose suspension had become termination after the commission's final report. Derek Mills, no longer employed by the sheriff's department, but also Jerome and his daughter Jasmine. The 13 other fathers whose cases had been reopened. May, proud and still fighting. Lily, sitting beside Sarah in the front row. Marcus presented the evidence. 143 heartbeats between approaching the microphone and beginning to speak. He counted every one. For 18 months, 14 black fathers in this town faced systematic discrimination in family court. We documented 2.1 minutes of hearing time compared to 5.8 for white fathers. We documented bias so consistent it couldn't be explained by coincidence. The town hall erupted, some in support, others in anger. But the facts were facts. The documentation was documentation. Truth, once spoken, couldn't be unspoken. The town council voted to request a federal investigation. Civilian oversight for family court proceedings. Mandatory bias training for all judicial staff. It wasn't justice exactly. 11 of the 14 fathers had won their cases back, but 3 remained in legal limbo. Tom faced 14 months in prison but would eventually walk free. Harrington lost her pension but avoided criminal charges. But it was something. A crack in the foundation. Proof that resistance mattered. That evening, Marcus drove Sarah to Route 9, the same spot where they'd met 8 months earlier, where her alternator had died and pulled them back into each other's orbits. Why here? Because this is where we started, again. He pulled the ring from his pocket. Not the original, he'd never found it at the pawn shop, but a new one. Different, like they were different, like everything was different now. 12 years ago, I planned to ask you this in Washington Park. You left before I could. I spent a decade angry about it, then another few years learning to forgive. And now I'm asking, not because we're the same people we were, but because we're better versions of who we were. Marcus, I'm not finished. You hurt me. You made choices out of fear that cost us both. But you came back. You stayed. You fought beside me when leaving would have been easier. That counts for something. That counts for everything. He opened the box. Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? She was crying, nodding, laughing all at once. Yes, God, yes, I don't deserve this, but yes. Nobody deserves anything. We just decide what we're going to build together. The wedding was small. Marcus's farm, early July, 60 people crowded onto the lawn. May officiated. She'd gotten ordained online specifically for this purpose. And Lily served as flower girl, beaming as she scattered petals with theatrical flourish. Jerome and the other fathers attended, their families mixing with Marcus and Sarah's. Carl Henderson gave a toast about redemption and second chances. Even Rita Chen came, hugging Marcus and whispering that his job was secure. During the reception, Lily pulled Marcus and Sarah together for a photograph. Put your hands on her belly, like this. She arranged them carefully, then stepped back, satisfied. Now you look like a real family. Marcus glanced at Sarah, who was crying again. Are you? 6 weeks. I was going to tell you after the ceremony. After the... Sarah, that's... I know. This time I'm not running. This time we do it together. They danced as the sun set. The farm transformed by string lights and the presence of people who'd become family through choice rather than blood. May watched from her chair, arthritis making movement difficult but satisfaction making everything worthwhile. Marcus pulled Sarah close, their foreheads touching. I used to think love required perfection, that mistakes were disqualifying. And now? Now I think love requires showing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Everything else is just details. Bigger than the sky? Bigger than the sky. Years later, when Marcus told this story to their son, Lily's half-brother, born the following February, he would talk about the importance of fighting even when the system seemed designed to crush you, about how healing wasn't forgetting, but rather choosing to build something new from the broken pieces, about how family meant belonging, and belonging meant showing up, day after day after day, until the showing up itself became the foundation. The town hall meeting had changed Millbrook. Not completely. Racism doesn't evaporate because one judge gets fired, but measurably. The 14 fathers' cases led to policy reforms in 3 counties. Harrington's termination sent a message that bias carried consequences. Tom's conviction proved that organized harassment could be prosecuted. But more than any institutional change, what mattered was the community that had formed in resistance. The fathers who'd found each other through shared struggle. The families who'd learned that isolation was the enemy's greatest weapon. The recognition that love, real love, required more than sentiment. It required action, consistency, sacrifice. Marcus never forgot the fear he'd felt standing on Route 9 that November afternoon, weighing whether helping Sarah was worth the risk. He never forgot the anger he'd carried for 12 years, or the forgiveness that had cost him so much to offer. He never forgot the night Tom's trucks had appeared on his property, or the moment Judge Torres had ruled in his favor, or the feeling of Sarah's hand in his as they said their vows. Because those moments, the hard ones, the frightening ones, the triumphant ones, were the moments that built a life worth living. Not perfect, not easy, but real, present, bigger than any individual fear or failure or flaw. Bigger, as May would say, than the sky itself.